TTT Studio is an online cafe where we discuss emergent theories of reality with a special focus on speculative realism and flat ontologies. We are also focused on developing our own flat ontology with a relational twist that is dubbed simply TTT. In TTT Studio, we navigate the possibilities for a relational ontology based on a dialogue guided by literal things presented each week by one of the participants. The things presented will be available in a picture shown on the left side of the screen. In the description, you can also find an introduction to the main concepts of TTT.
This week I will be talking about the Xenofeminist Manifesto, which is a political sociological manifesto that draws from a lot of research lines in philosophy, like cyber feminism and accelerationism. And I will start by, as usual in our TTT sessions, introduce an image that you can see in the background of my face at the moment. As Luis very well mentioned, this is the artist Arca, photographed by Frederick Hyman for their cover of their EP at the at symbol. I chose this image because I think it touches on many points that this manifesto also touches. And actually, the name of the first ever EP by this artist Arca is called Xen, Xen, and comes exactly from the same origin that the title of this manifesto comes, which is from the Greek other or alter, basically the one that is not me, the other. And we know this word from, like, for example, in the Alien series, there's the xenomorphs, or in the word xenophobia, for example, and they present themselves exactly like that here in the manifesto. By the way, the manifesto is written by Laboria Cubonics, which is a pen name for a group of five different people from across the world. They are philosophers, physicists, neuroscientists, a group of five different people, and they are looking to write exactly that, and other type of feminism. That in of itself can be extremely controversial claim, right? To say that there's one feminism and then another feminism can already be a controversial claim. But I think what's interesting about this text is that it actually argues for a type of an ontology, in a way, the same way that it came here into TTT is because it appeals, I guess, to me and to many others here on those terms. The basic idea of this text is that having a what they call a naturalistic approach is actually removing from what the authors consider what is they call the true natural. The examples they give are mostly have to do with technology. So, say, for example, something very quoted in this text is reproduction technology. When you have a female body and then you first introduce how do you call it, the birth control pill, then you introduce into society what some people call anti-natural means of some people, for example, the church, the Catholic Church, not non-natural means of controlling your body and controlling nature and bending nature. And what the authors argue towards is that this type of technology and this type of action is actually what they call what is it? There's a very beautiful word that they use. Is I have it here in a note. Wait. It's the good manipulation versus what they would call a bad manipulation. The idea being that by utilizing this technology, you actually can start to bend, quote unquote, bend, I'm citing them, what is said to be natural and create something that they call a new natural. So I'm going to read just a quote from the text that I think explains this quite well. Um, Nature as an unremarkable given, which has been employed to justify social hierarchies, genocides, and distributions of power, etc. Here, uh, we pause to explain that this position eventually implies an unflinching ontological naturalism. That means that all the mutable, evolving, constructed, invented, imagined phenomena are not distinguished from nature in any way. They are actually the one and only nature there is. To say that nothing is sacred, that nothing is transcendent, or projected or protected from the will to know, to tinker, and to hack, is to say that nothing is supernatural. Nature, understood as the unbounded arena of science, is all there is. So this in this paragraph, they describe what I think is uh, the most relevant thing to take away from this text into TTT, which is this idea that um, in an ontological sense, they are treating, for example, technology and biology as equal on the same footing. They don't put an idea um, or a piece of software in a hierarchical position against, say, uh, biological matter. So I think that's a very interesting key takeaway from this text in our context, of course. Um, and the reason why I chose the photo of Arca is because it I think now it maybe is more evident, but they argue towards the manipulation of the body and the manipulation of law and principle as a means to uh, escape that which they call the natural, or the old natural, and to become something that is still natural but on a different level of ontology. So I don't know if that's a good enough intro, but there's many more things they talk about, but I think we can start discussing, and then we'll keep I can keep clarifying what their take is on different topics as we go along.
Yeah, I think that's perfect for initiating the discussion. Does anybody have comments or questions?
Just a short question. Can you spell out what does they understand under nature or the new natural, please?
Yeah, I have a question along those lines also. Can you reread the sentence where they mention science?
Yes. Nature is understood here as the unbounded arena of science.
So things that cannot be studied by science are not natural.
I think they would argue everything can be studied by science.
Maybe
Scientism in Xenofeminism. It's interesting.
but also I think regarding to Federica's question, if I understood the intention right, nature can be used in two ways, right? As the sum of all natural things, or in a more adjective kind of way, like the description of what is essential about something. And so either the world constituted by natural things, or the way things are, called the nature of things. Which one of the concepts do they address here?
Yeah, so that's maybe I didn't manage to get that across, but the whole point is that people would say, most people on the surface level would say, this is an anti-naturalist manifesto, in the sense that it goes against what people say is the essential properties of things. So what it's actually doing is proposing the idea that you should go beyond what is seen as the essential nature of things by even manipulating them purposely to do so. But instead, what they're saying is that by doing that, they become the second thing that you are talking about, which is actually nature, because nature involves everything, including the things that are anti-naturalist.
Okay. But then one thing that I maybe missed is by by taking the stance against naturalism and by referring to a new natural, do they propose switching from an old way of describing essential relations or properties to a new way of describing them? Or do they propose getting rid of the concept of nature as essential traits of reality?
The nature as in naturalism, right?
No,
So the last sentence, when you use the word nature, you were referring to essential properties of stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, so the latter.
So no, but my question is more, do they propose a revision of what is understood under essence, or getting rid of the concept of essence?
Getting rid
Okay.
of the concept of essence.
Okay. So what they're criticizing is not nature, it's more the political construct
Yes,
of nature.
exactly.
Yeah, it's from what I had understood when I read the manifesto, it seemed that they are completely rejecting the concept of natural fallacy, you know, this idea that what is natural is good and should be pursued. And instead, they say that the goal is to update nature, and that nature doesn't come with any normativity, but that as soon as you use this means to change your sex, to modify your body, etc., suddenly it becomes part of nature, and it's kind of the living proof that there is no such thing possible as natural fallacy. This idea that you create a new normativity, so you discard actively, you prove that nature is more than just what you know already. Is it something like this, Thiago?
Yeah, and Luis pasted a really good quote. We find that our normative anti-naturalism has pushed us towards an unflinching ontological naturalism.
That's a bit vague. For me.
Yeah.
No, but I'm not sure. I don't understand the word unflinching, actually. So what does that mean, unflinching?
It means they will not be flexible on it.
Yeah.
And they will be brave.
Yeah, but I think that's the very interesting point about this this manifesto, is to say that, and I mean, there are related points, I guess, in the feminist movements, is that by focusing on overcoming gender roles or distributing roles as equally as possible, you actually give a lot of importance to these natural descriptions, while you could just discard them.
But from what I understood, they do call themselves abolitionists of gender, in the sense that in the same way that they are against naturalism, they're not against gender per se, they're against the political power structures that use gender in order to reinforce themselves, but they are still for gender.
Exactly. And one important thing is so they are often put in opposition to another movement called ecofeminism, which you may be more familiar with than this, which argues exactly the opposite. For example, One very distinguishing feature is, for example, the position as to what relates to trans identity, be it transsexual or transgender. Here they are very firmly advocating that transness or trans identity or transsexualism is as quote unquote natural as anything else, because it's no different from everything else. So they are saying that it's basically, that's why they say a flat ontology, because they're trying to say is exactly the same as any other manifestation of identity or of sex. Whereas in ecofeminism, like a radical ecofeminism would say, like this, there's not many people like this in the world, but radical ecofeminism would say that, or so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminism would say, for example, a trans woman is not really a woman, because the category women is secured for these people that have quote-unquote natural, they're quote-unquote natural women, right? So this is one of the topics in which they have very clear opposite approaches.
Okay, so we have already two bridges to TTT. One is the anti-naturalist stance. The other one is the anti-essentialist stance. But as far as I understood it, xenofeminism defines itself as strictly rationalist, while in TTT, even though we do argue for the equality of all things and against their strict reductionism to naturalist point of view, we don't understand ourselves as strictly rationalist. And this for a specific reason, because in my view at least, rationalism is tightly connected to a sort of alienation that supports a detached subject, which also acts as a starting point for introducing hierarchies or precisely the power relations that they try to avoid. But in xenofeminism, they use the concept of alienation in a positive manner. And I was curious to know, maybe you can explain how this alienation concept is being used and why do they insist on rationalism? Maybe we can draw some parallels between TTT and relationality, which is, so by having a relational reality, you also have an embedded subject which is equal to all things around it, and they co-constitute and they are non-detachable from one another. Rationalism presupposes the possibility of a rational being also being able to take control over the relations going on around it. So yeah, maybe you can clarify this a bit. I was
So
confused a bit.
I have to preface by saying I'm not an expert on this text. Maybe I'm the local expert, but that doesn't mean much. But it is indeed the subtitle of the thing. It's called Xenofeminism: A Politics for Alienation. So the concept of alienation is really crucial for the whole idea behind this. And as Razvan said, it's seen in positive eyes as in opposition to many other ways of seeing alienation. In a way, by posing themselves as pro alienation, they have to use rationality, as you said, as a tool to explain why. So the idea is that alienation is how do you say, it's when something is, you cannot, it just exists, imminent, I guess. No, it's always happening. Alienation is always happening under the current capitalist society, and they they argue that the acceleration of this alienation is what is going to lead to a progress in society. This acceleration of alienation is therefore only possible if you are in complete control of your body, your choices, etc. And that's why they are stuck with the rationalism approach, is because they have, if you were not in complete control or in charge of who you are and what you can do, then you have no way to manipulate, say, your body, say, matter, say, thoughts into what they talk about, which is this alienation state of complete alienation.
But it seemed paradoxical to me that they try to be as progressive and disruptive as possible, but they still employ a fairly conservative strategy to appeal to reason and rationalism in order to detach yourself from what would be the foreign determination on you, this naturalism imposed on one, and lead that disruption or that alienation to its maximal point until something occurs. Is that the main logic?
Yes.
But that's still, for me, that inscribes itself in a more conservative manner of seeing things, which, for example, Heidegger has this idea of technology, that technology alienates ourselves from nature to the point of complete nihilism, where in that point of nihilism where we see the void of everything, change will eventually happen, but not from a technological standpoint, but from an artistical one. The same can also be traced back to idealists, where the focus on self-development has to be brought to a maximal point in which a revolution within people starts, by which we truly become free. So I'm trying to understand what is the difference to this, the more progressive part of it, because like critical theory, for example, criticizes this exact stance for leading towards a more right-wing approach to reality, which imposes aesthetics and power relations on world based on this progress concept.
I would say that they have been, for example, this text has been used quite extensively in that discourse, especially when it comes to the point of accelerationism, right? That where people talk about that accelerating something like can lead to this autocratic type of regime. What they talk about is that the progress with which the progressive stance is that the destination is not fixed by them in the manifesto. So, and the manifesto itself is open to iteration. So that's how they try to steer away from that critique by saying that everything is mutable, right? Even the manifesto itself, even the ways in which you conduct things.
Mm-hmm. So
but
it's more of
only
an
through
anarchic kind of rationalism.
Yes.
Okay.
Only through maximal mutation, let's put it like that, will you achieve progress. That's what they're saying.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to comment or question?
I have a comment, which is, I guess I have a few, but to put in a new one or something that we haven't yet been discussing, can we abstract the xenofeminism to just produce xeno whatever it is? So so we're not focused on that particular domain, but apply the same idea to everything? Or is there some reason that we should only think about gender in those terms?
They actually abstracted themselves when talking about the text. They talk about using the word feminism because at its core, feminism is about equality. So they talk about a new type of equality. So they're almost talking about when they talk, they usually give examples about like gender and things like that, because I guess that's what the authors were most familiar with. But you can really abstract it and talk about, when they talk about this idea of seeing the world, you can abstract it to any topic, I would say. And some authors have used this text to abstract it to other fields, and in special to science, to politics in general, software, technology development. So it's basically, yeah, that's it. Yeah. I don't know if that answered, but.
So last time, actually, I don't know if you remember, but on WhatsApp, I noticed I copy-paste something which was saying that basically Xenofeminism, or this artist that Giorgio shared, who is related to Xenofeminism, wanted to basically free trans, gender fluid, women, all, and even animal bodies. And there was no reference to liberating the male bodies. There was really a focus on either these trans bodies, female bodies, or animal bodies, but not male bodies. And you said I have a long response to make to it, but time doesn't, sleep doesn't give me the time. So I'm curious to know, because it's something which, is becoming a bit of a topic of debate in society now that feminism is progressing. It's like, and actually making conceptual advances of that type, because I think there is something like a conceptual and intellectual progress in this thing, which is called xenofeminism. And some people are a bit like, some males are a bit like, well, but why are we excluded from that progress? And yeah, so that's a question I have also. And I understand that you say, like they include everything, but it doesn't feel like it in the text. Even if they specifically, if they say specifically that they have nothing against males and that males are needed, etc., but the liberation seems to be only.
I think someone mentioned abolitionism before, and they do give a good example on about gender abolitionism being applied to the same concept being applied to race abolitionism, and ultimately class abolitionism, which is just a political structure created to divide society, and some class exert control over another class, be it gender, be it any other divisor. So I don't see feminism as something that applies only to non-males, but something that applies to all individuals. So whenever I see someone propose an advance towards feminism, in this case, at least I interpret it as a general advance for society, for all individuals. If it's abolitionist, if it's gender abolitionist in this case.
But this seems like if we start with feminism and then we say enlarge it in that way, just to talk about different social roles, then do we then end up with something that emphasizes humans versus nature? Like, are we okay? So in other words, does that mean we're okay to choose how our bodies should be? Does that mean we're also okay to choose how nature should, like we talk about climate change? Is that then okay because we choose whatever. So climate, natural, whatever, coral reefs can go to hell. Like, it's humans decide.
I would say
Like-
they would agree with that statement.
I think they have to be consistent.
Yeah, and they do. Yeah.
But they don't talk about that in the manifesto.
Well, I think they do.
I read it. I don't remember that. I mean, a lot of these
It's
things.
implied. It's implied.
Implicit,
It's implicit. Yeah.
But I think, like, I guess, like, there's certain, like, trying to come at it from the perspective of an ontology that's trying to be flat. It feels like we have to go. I don't know, we have to go to those cases that are not human, or those cases like that are not really analyzed, and see whether it makes sense. Or does it, like, I guess I'm going to go back to Razvan's fear, I guess, that because it's tilted toward rationality, it's kind of ending up being a not very flat ontology in which rational humans decide how the world will be, because it kind of places rational humans at the top of everything. Which, do we need to do that to get some of the same flatness? Because if we ultimately end up with something that is not at all flat, that's like the thing that speculative realism, well, not speculative realism, the thing that object-oriented ontologies and TTT try to get away from, in part, is that human and other hierarchy.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking exactly something similar to what Sachs was saying, because like, my understanding of the xenofeminist theory is that, like, historically is very much indebted and actually, like, pushing to the limits some posthumanist theories, and especially like the cyborg theory of Donna Haraway. And actually, like, Donna Haraway in her last book says exactly that she decided to abandon the posthumanist concept because this idea of post-naturalism was getting dangerous, like when faced to climate change, or like, I mean, the big ecological struggle of our times. So actually, that's basically my big problem with this xenofeminist idea. Like, I totally agree with the analysis, but then I feel that, like, I'm a bit confused on the like politics of it in terms of, for example, climate change and ecology in general.
Yeah, I think in my interpretation and from reading like the authors talking about it, I think they do accept that as something unescapable from their theory. That, like, there's a quote in the end of the text that says, "Nature shall no longer be a refuge or injustice, of injustice, or a basis for any political justification whatsoever." So what they're trying to say is that you shouldn't use nature in any way to justify any political justification, and that includes, I would, at least in my interpretation, for example, ecology, right? So they would probably say that you shouldn't be using that to decide on policy. You should be using rationality, what they call rationality.
This is where I have, like, I understand the main drive behind it, and I agree with it, and I think it's nice the emphasis they make on international effort, collective effort, instead of this washing your hands kind of buy local, recycle things. But at the same time, I feel some conceptual tensions in the manifesto, in the way they approach nature. as if nature were not political. Like nature is always and has always been political for humans. This is the main critique that has been made to Hobbes, or ever since Hobbes. There is no one authentic nature that can be used. Nature is political and it is embedded within our political views. It's hard to talk against nature from a political stance as if nature were not political already. But my main concern with it is their emphasis on, but maybe I understand this wrong, their emphasis on intersectionality as universalism. And this is, I struggle to understand it. Like intersectionality for me is an important political and feminist concept in which the oppressive suffering that somebody feels is not boiled down to just one logic, like the class struggle. There is also the the women's oppression part. There's also race oppression, and I got the feeling that they try to boil everything down to one axis, which tries to expand across multiple situations without allowing for this locality of unique combination of factors which makes the suffering, the personal suffering under oppressive measures, highly important. Should I quote where they talk about?
Yeah, you can quote, but I think I agree with you.
Let me just, yeah, so the universal must be grasped as generic, which is to say intersectional. Intersectionality is not the morcellation of collectives into a static fuzz of cross-referenced identities, but a political orientation that slices through every particular, refusing the crass pigeonholing of bodies. This is not a universal that can be imposed from above, but built from the bottom up, or better, laterally opening new lines of transit across an uneven landscape. This non-absolute generic universality must guard against facile tendency of conflation with bloated, unmarked particulars, whereby the male is mistaken for the sexless, the white for raceless, the cis for the real, and so on.
It sounds a bit TTT-ish in some way. In that it's defining relationality. I guess intersectionality sounds a lot like relationality there.
Yes, that's how I understood it, but I got the feeling that they understand it in a different way. But maybe it's because of my inability to grasp the way they phrase it. So that's why I'm asking.
The language is nice, although it's not filled with an abundance of clarity. It's not exactly, it's Dennetian, we could say. It's got a bit of Dennett in there.
Maybe why I like it.
So Scott, you're saying that they understand the intersectionality not in a universalist kind of way, but in a relational, interpenetrating, or more dynamical way. That's what I struggle with.
In the conversation last week, there was this discussion of reduction, and there's a possibility that TTT was trying to reduce to relations. And the answer being relations are important, so you can't really reduce them because they are many. So intersectionality seems to be, in this case, something similar. You're not, I think many people sort of naively approach intersectionality as being, I am 20% of this group and 10% of that group, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're against the whole idea, then it's considered to be some sort of oppression Olympics, and people make jokes about it. And both those ideas about the theory seem kind of false. It's more acknowledging that you have multiple identities that come to the fore in different circumstances. And some of those are placed upon you by others, and some of those you bring yourself. So I think in that sense, that seems very much relational in its design. So like those intersections are not necessarily permanent or independent of the environment. They're just relational structures. So I think in that sense, it's quite clear. If that's what it means. Go ahead.
I wanted to go back to the questions of Razvan and Zach, if I understood them well, I would like to rephrase or reformulate the same preoccupation, in the sense that the tension I see, like in the project of xenofeminism, is between the basis or the grounding of it, which is profoundly hierarchical, in the sense that it's anthropocentric because it is based on this superiority of human beings because of their rationality. Whereas at the same time, they want to have as a goal a non-hierarchical society. And I see exactly there the tension. The basis of their arguments are hierarchical, whereas the goals of them are non-hierarchical. I don't know if you agree, Tiago.
Can I just ask, on the basis, like, are you sure they mean that only people are rational?
Well, they say
that was going to be my reply, actually. They don't.
Because like evolution, I've done a lot of evolution. Well, I haven't done a lot, but I've had to distinguish behavioral game theory from evolutionary game theory. And in evolutionary game theory, nature, if you want to call it that, is rational in principle. And that one assumes it is rational when you're making the calculations for like what genes will progress for certain interactions or what phenotypes will survive. So there's a sense in which natural selection is fundamentally a rational process. I'm not sure I agree that it is, but like that's when they say rationality, I don't know if they mean that in the sense of like human rationality of a way of thinking, or just that sort of cold rationality as being as fitting with normative assumptions.
I think it's sort of human rationality as I understood it in the text. Like they, in the moment, they want like to separate like the natural from in the old view, let's say, in the old view of nature, the natural would be under the rational. So there are a lot of tensions also there, because they are also playing with both concepts of nature. And in that sense, they say, in the way that we have rationality, we can overcome this like natural state. So I believe they're talking about human rationality and not a rationality within nature. Like, for example, in my case that I know very well, Aristotle, there's like a rationality within nature. I actually think exactly the opposite. They are basing their ideas on the human rationality.
They are referring to human rationality, like reason and rationality in the history of thought.
Huh.
So
that just seems
which
like
is coherent, because they try to criticize patriarchy that expands via thought and rational narratives. It would be for me a bit inconsistent that they ascribe rationalism to nature in this sense. I do think they so in this sense, I do think they rely a lot on rationalism in the classical philosophical view.
This seems a weird stance to take given the rest of it, right? It's like that's a sort of an oppressive position to take.
That was also my immediate reaction when reading it.
But it's
like if you get rid of the sacred, maybe you need rationality. I don't know.
But they see such a dichotomy between rationality and everything else that they can't imagine collapsing that dichotomy. So they say like, well, if it's rationality or other, I'll take rationality, which is fine. Like they don't want to give up science. They want to take it over. Like there's a lot of that, which fine, but it seems strange that they can't see beyond science to practice even that is not scientific.
That seems sort of, it's almost as though they removed all other things that are stable that they can rely upon. Everything sort of becomes in flux or somewhat non-defined. So they need some, I don't know, something that's set apart from everything else. And that means for them, like, rationality is sacred.
But I understood it in a more in in a more performative manner, in the sense, like Tiago was saying in the beginning, we get alienated. Let's drive that alienation through reason to its very last end until we're finally free from natural constrictions which were imposed on us, either via instrumentalization of natural behavior or by nature itself, like biological sex, and then become free. So, like, I think that they use the same way the concept of technology. Technology is oppressing, is oppressive, but if we lead it to its very last potential, it can also be liberating. So I think they're playing with this duality of rationality, technology, science, nature, whatever, that at the moment they are, let's say, infused with this will to power that oppresses. And if we take those concepts, which at the moment are oppressive, and we lead them to this contradictory state in which they turn upon themselves and become tools of liberation, that would be a way to go. So I think they're against this romanticism of returning to nature or getting rid of technology or rationality. And in this sense, I sympathize with them. But at the same time, I think it's hard to do what they want without running the danger of imposing new restrictions or new oppressive measures or new dichotomies.
I think they are. I agree with you, Razvan. That's the way I see it too, and I think they are, as I was saying before, also they are aware of these that it can take this path. But they also say, I cannot find the quote anymore. But they talk about how they see it as they see this theory as a sort of basis to build upon and not a goal. So in a way, they don't want to say which direction it should take. They're trying to propose a method to towards what they call alienation, or what you were saying, like to be truly free. So that's, I think, how they avoid talking about the elephant in the room, which is the same critique that has been done to, as I was saying before, like theories of accelerationism, for example. And they find refuge in playing with these dichotomies, as you were saying, by giving a few examples. They give very little examples, but they give a few examples on what they think would be a good way forward. For example, in technology, they talk about how current technology is developed historically by men and fueled by consumption, and they argue, we can change this. We can make technology that is fueled by none of these quote unquote natural things like consuming or being a man. So that's what they're trying to say.
Yeah, I understand. And I think there's valuable insights for TTT, for example, in how to address certain societal issues from a relational stance by proposing first that that relationality should be increased so that uh, none of the social media phenomenon should be centralized into one agent of trust, which is mostly a privileged institution or subject, that they argue for situational based universalism, if now that I reread the quote and Scott explained it to me, in which you never have one absolute value that determines everything. I think these are valuable insights. However, I think the TTT framework, which starts from relation, so from the space in between, which maybe doesn't have the ability to gain power, like Sartre was saying, when you abolish every value and you're just left in this state of in between states and in between determinations, there is no possibility for power to arise unless you fix those relations into a stable structure. And TTT chooses this starting point of relation, so being in between stable determinations, as the starting point for an ontology. And by choosing relation as this in between state, we can say it is, let's say, natural to enter in certain relations, economical, political, whatever, but those relations are always self-revisionist. They can always be redefined and reabsorbed into other situations. So therefore, you cannot impose oppressive measures and justify them based on some artificially constructed, authentic, natural determination without having to use this debatable concept of rationalism. This is how I would see marrying the two together and trying to argue for a betterment of xenofeminism from a relational standpoint and not from a rationalist standpoint.
I feel like I agree. I like xenofeminism, or I like the manifesto. I admired a lot of it. And then when I'm analyzing it, I feel like I'm trying to get rid of resolve some dichotomies or some limitations. And the critique of rationality, or the embrace of rationality, is kind of like, I see it has two parts. There's one part which is a takeover of like the dominant power source in society, which is scientific technologicalism, and saying like we want to liberate it. And that is like let's say the positive side, or maybe you say the negative side of it. I don't know, positive, negative, doesn't matter. On the other side is putting rationality, science and technology at the top, like keeping them at the top. And if there's nothing to give up in that, like look at it like this, that's good, but what are we possibly excluding? Is there something that is that embrace like excluding anything reasonable? Or if you frame it in that way, everything has to be rational. Otherwise, if it's not rational, then we're going to exclude it. So does that exclude, like, what, like they want to embrace some kind of individualism where people choose themselves either individually or collectively. But what if people choose non-rationally? Like, what if people just, I don't know, I'm reminded of the Lars von Trier movie, The Idiots, which has this amazing depiction of these people who decide to live as if they're like completely without rationality. So they go and just act as stupid as possible, but I don't know, that's kind of an understatement if anyone's seen the movie. But they get so into it, they descend into this kind of pre-human state, and they love it. So I'm just thinking of that as an example of, like, is that xenofeminism is really against that? Like, there's a principled stance in favor of rationality and against irrationality. I'm not necessarily against that. Like, maybe that's an interesting stance, but I want to ask this question: what might one be putting in second place by turning everything around knowledge and science? Are we really, TTT does not make that embrace that distinction, or that it doesn't call the game all for rationality. The question like this doesn't come up, but it seems to come up a lot for me in the xenofeminism.
I get the impression that if you're not rational, they'll strip you naked and strap you to a car. Possibly, I'm not sure, but this might be an indication of the punishment the xenofeminists will deal out for irrational behavior. It's a little bit frightening.
I would say that looks very pleasurable, to be honest.
Well, I guess whatever you're into, that's fine.
But on rationality, isn't it the fact that they define themselves as rationalists? I feel it has to do with their desire to take over, basically, because when you read the manifesto, clearly this is they don't call themselves a revolutionary movement, but what they want to do is a revolution. They want to do it without violence, etc. But they really say that they need to organize themselves in groups, to use technology, otherwise they will never reach their goals. And so I think they claim to be rationalists more in the sense of embracing fully science and technology as means to change the world. And they position themselves a bit in contrast with other movements which share the same sensibility, the same goals, but discard or are very technoseptic and therefore are condemned to be ineffective.
It's a little bit like they know naturalism, like they're very familiar with it, so they know what's wrong with it. And they're like, no, that naturalism, that's not going to do. Everything is natural or nothing is natural. Both are the same thing.
Yeah.
But they don't know rationality so well, I think, or they don't know science and technology so well. And they're sort of saying like, we want those things without realizing that we don't necessarily consider ourselves rationalists in the field of science. I think that's the impression that I get.
I wouldn't say actually that they are talking about science as we see it today.
But they're
not. I wouldn't say they are talking about let's use technology like we have it now. They talk about let's use the potential of technology. And the
no, I mean rationality. So like I think they have a very clear view of naturalism and its problems, and then they're sort of focusing on a happy caricature of rationality a little bit.
Maybe so this is my interpretation. I think you can interpret it both ways. My interpretation is along the lines of the people that were doing the non-rational things, like Zach was saying. They would say they would still be doing rational things if it was their choice.
I have a question that might lead to a comment. So, by rationality, do they understand the potential of fully self-developing oneself without being restricted by these natural imposed restrictions? Tiago?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
I'm not sure I understood the question actually.
So they support the concept of alienation in a positive manner as liberating oneself from these natural determinations, either politically imposed or biologically. This seems to me to imply that they favor this alienation because it might lead to the possibility of individuals to self-develop themselves to their full potential because they're unrestricted.
Yeah.
And I have
Okay, now I understood better. Yeah.
Okay.
So I would say yes, and that's I think I was saying that also in the beginning, that the whole rationalism thing has to do with kind of ownership also, legitimization of your actions. So they have an interesting quote also. I cannot find it now, but they say something along the lines of that whatever you do is your responsibility, and that's why you have the power to also change, right? Because not only you are an effector, but you will also be held responsible for it. And in the grand scheme of things, they're saying eventually we will, converge into a world where everyone is, like you were saying, like responsible for their own empowerment.
I understand. But like this brings me back to what Federica was saying, to the complexity of the concept of rationality and alienation. Because if you look at it historically, this kind of logic leads or may have the danger or the conceptual tension in it that by focusing on this potential of developing, you end up in a paradox in which you 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 try to potent too much your rationality, and the effective part, the let's say the lower parts of what makes us humans get ignored, get what's it called, repressed, to the point in which they impede your self development. Like this is the ontological, sociological critique of autonomy, that by focusing too much on the individual self development, you neglect the relationality of your being, of your person, the societal aspects that come into play, the non rational aspects which are part of our decisions, which eventually might lead to alienation as frustration, as inability to connect, to empathize, to resonate
Yep.
with your
Yep.
environment.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
I like I feel this can be a tension that weighs heavily on xenofeminism.
But I feel, maybe Thiago interrupt me, but I feel that they don't claim that they're rational over emotional, for example, that there is not this mutually exclusive stance on being either rational or irrational, or, like I think that what they try to promote is the idea that rationality and all the tradition, the philosophical tradition of rationality, all the sciences which revolve around the concept of rationality should be part of their movement. I don't think they want to exclude emotionality. I think it's more a call to not exclude rationality. You see what I mean? Which is maybe from the circles that they know and they interact with, might be in their eyes a problem.
So I think I agree with you in the sense that maybe they don't exclude emotionality, but they do proclaim themselves to be fully rationalist.
But fully, I mean, they don't say fully, they say it's a rationalism, but it can be a rationalism and something else, right?
I think what they want to say with this rationalist comment or passage is really in line with what Razvan is saying, also with what Romain is saying, that of course this is written for a certain audience, which is the usual feminist theory audience, but also at least it's my interpretation, right? I don't really know, but my interpretation is similar to yours, Razvan. So, but that said, I do think that when they talk about rationalism, they don't put it as hierarchically superior to something else. They are more saying that the movement needs to be grounded on rationalism.
Okay. I also see a silver lining in the manifesto, in the sense that they do tacitly imply that the rationalism that they defend is to be separated from the patriarchal rationalism that was usually used in the history of human thought. But they don't really, or at least I missed it, they don't really say how this new feminist rationalism should look like, freed of all of those shortcomings.
They do say it is true that the canonical history of thought is dominated by men, and it is male hands we see throttling existing institutions of science and technology. But this is precisely why feminism must be a rationalism, because of this miserable imbalance and not despite it. There is no feminine rationality, nor there is a masculine one. Science is not an expression, but a suspension of gender. If today it is dominated by masculine ego, then it is at odds with itself, and this contradiction can be leveraged. Reason, like information, wants to be free.
Okay, so then rationalism is freed of these dichotomies for them.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I said before, in that like they're used to naturalism and they sort of know it and its problems. The rationalism they describe, it does seem to be self-aware in that it's not just some happy caricature of science in where everything makes sense, but it's not the way we would criticize rationalism necessarily. Like there's something slightly funny about them sort of defending themselves preemptively from an attack of being told they're irrational, which is often what like various rights movements encounter, right? Is that the most conservative statement is sort of, ignore your feelings, what are the facts, what is science? And it seems like this comes slightly in response to that. But now we're all a bunch of scientists, or some of us are scientists at least, saying, well, the rationalism part doesn't really make sense. They're sort of defending themselves from an attack where science is misused and rationalism is misused, I think.
Which is what Romain was saying, that the audience that they're usually interacting with, that's one of the arguments that they always get struck with.
Exactly. Like they don't mean.
Do you see rationalism here as more of an anti-naturalism in this sense? Try to avoid the pitfalls of naturalism by negating it.
Yeah, I think at its basis they're sort of saying like we're not soft. We're governed by data. We're governed by these important rational things. We're not just turning our back on good thought or reason or things like this. I feel like that's the position they're taking. They're trying to point out that they're not playing games. They're serious in that.
I found another quote that I found interesting in the context of TTT, which is from the global to the local, from the cloud to our bodies. Xenofeminism avows the responsibility in constructing new institutions of techno-materialist hegemonic proportions, etc., like engineers who must conceive a total structure as well as the molecular parts from which it is constructed. Xenofeminism emphasizes the importance of the mesopolitical sphere against the limited effectiveness of local gestures. Then they give examples, and then the mesopolitical arena of xenofeminism, universalist ambitions, comprehends itself as a mobile and intricate network of transits between these polarities. As pragmatists, we invite contamination as a mutational driver between such frontiers. So here there's a lot of relationism going on.
Seems like they're doing a lot of, they're trying to take words back, I think. Like there's definitely sort of a reasonable, I think, linguistic assault. And like this is, so you guys keep on using rationality against us. Actually, rationality is this and we like it. What was, they used another word there? I forgot it when I was speaking. That was
alienation. I think they do the same with alienation because it's what I wanted to say a bit earlier. Like, and in general, this creates this weird impression. Or are they trying to kind of shock and violate a bit our expectations of the use of words in a purposeful way, like intentionally, to force us to change the meaning of the words? Or is it more that it's a bit sloppy at the conceptual level? Like I'm not sure. For example, on the alienation, I remember having really my attention captured by this very original statement of saying, let's make alienation a strength instead of a weakness. Let's embrace it instead of fighting it. But then you read the rest of the text, and in many parts you have statements which are typically what you would find in a sociological analysis, which try to free you from alienation. So I don't know. It's like So then you don't use alienation in the sense that it has been used in sociology for so many years. It's like,
I think that's a normal process in this. It's nice to have the long quote, at least to sort of like point out where they do it. There was one other phrase they changed. I forget what it was, but like this has been done multiple times. Like for example, race is those terms that is from critical theory approaches has been sort of, and from population genetics, to be fair, has been pointed out to be not what it originally was. Right? It's not a biologically grounded concept. It's a mythical concept that has to have superficial biological correlates. And like, so like that term has been reclaimed. But then there's this endless battle, right? When someone says, make some statement where the more critical use of race makes sense, but doesn't in the classic sense, then people just refuse to listen to each other a lot of the time. Or rather, one using the traditional term will refuse to listen to the other most of the time. So there's that clear sense in which part of the idea of this critical theory approach to things is that you have to reclaim language and use those words in a way that makes more sense. And really the only other option is neologisms. Those are annoying. So like either they just create a whole new words that no one wants to say, or they reoccupy the words that exist and change their meaning. And like neither is ideal, because it would be nice to sort of have version control of language where you could go back and look as words change in a more understandable way. But this doesn't work that way. Like I think they need to occupy the language and say, look, this word now means that, because that's the closest way in which it relates to what it sort of meant originally, but also how it's functionally being deployed.
They also have a cool quote where they talk about how they want the manifesto to be seen as sorts as a programming language of sorts, where you reuse the existing functions to write new ones. So it goes along with what you're saying, Scott. Like they're very much for this idea of appropriating, and of course they always also drink a bit from Marxist theory, and the appropriation, the whole appropriation thing is very strong here.
I also understand it that way, but I wanted to address this part as well, this programming part. They refer to the liberative potential of the internet, especially the text-based internet. And I wanted to address the more tech-savvy audience here, because I was reading about the potential of the internet and how a lot of people saw in the internet the the actualization of what Deleuze called the rhizomatic structures, like decentralized, collaborative, collective, um, growing and becoming of entities in reality. A lot of people have associated it with the internet, especially in the beginning phases. But there's also a lot of critiques that say that the internet and hypertext is based on a tree logic, which is precisely what Deleuze criticizes. The tree logic being everything can be derived from one or several main functions, which then just rearrange themselves in order to produce variations of themselves. How would you see?
I think there's two layers to it. There's the architectural layer, and then there's the content layer. I think on the architectural layer, what you're saying is indeed true, right? So, because it is hierarchical. But on the content layer, I think it's a layer that they're talking about, as in the expression that people have and the dialogue that is generated has that potential of what you're talking about.
Okay, I see. And
so
then,
I think there's two different layers.
But then they also criticize the visual aspect of the internet, and they strictly refer memes. But to be honest, memes also have propagated themselves to political effects that maybe none have expected. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Eric.
No, it's fine. I was gonna say, yeah, I think what Tiago was saying, actually, it also relates to something I wanted to ask about or comment on from what Scott said. So the internet, I think, first, it's not a thing really. It's at best a set of things. And in some sense, as Tiago said, there's different layers or there's different ways of looking at it. In fact, it's a kind of good example of, I guess, a TTT object in the sense that it's a collection, of a number of things, and depending on your context or situation, how you're looking at it, you probably define it differently. I think the thing that you were referring to and that people referred to optimistically when it was arriving was both that it contrasted with the traditional systems, which were monotheistic, right? You had monolithic, sorry. You had these systems, CompuServe and other large computers where people logged in and had access to particular data sets or particular things in one place. And the internet was something that was distributed at all levels and allowed interconnection at all levels. And so, especially with the introduction of hypertext, even before there was a World Wide Web or memes or social media or any of that stuff, one of the underlying principles was if you existed on the internet, someone could link to you and you could link to somebody else. And at least to a first approximation, that was all public. So I think conceptually, I don't really understand the kinds of criticisms that you would be describing at that level. Of course, as was being pointed out, there's a totally different level at which it operates, which is a social sphere on top of it, how you look for information, what information you follow, memes you spread, all the rest of it. But that to me is reflections of humanity in the system and not the system itself. Does that make some sense, Razvan?
Yes, it makes. Like the critique was being made on the architectural level, the way hypertext is structured on a tree logic
it's
structure.
I think that would be just technically it would be a stretch. In the sense that it is it's an interconnected graph. It has by sort of definition of a tree. Anytime you have a graph, right? Anytime you have a bunch of nodes and a bunch of lines, you can always choose one to be the root, and then everything else becomes a tree with interconnecting branches. So there's a sort of trivial way in which that could be true, but at least it's not philosophically, conceptually, or the goals of the system. So that seems to be would be a pretty oblique attack.
Yes, I would say, Razvan, that, for example, a lot of people in internet are now developing graph-based architectures instead of tree-based architectures for web pages, where you don't have if you go to many web pages, you don't have a menu, you just have navigation, and you just iterate through navigation. But of course, not only for historical reasons, but mostly for historical reasons, even the operating systems themselves are based on files and hierarchy of files and folders. So that's the way that eventually the internet came to be. But for example, I'm attending this conference in February where this guy made a non-file based, non-hierarchical operating system. And I don't know how it works, but it's even hard to conceptualize. But there's people thinking already about these things, and I think they are pointing to that as as you were saying, Razvan. I think they point to that as a weakness, but they want to say that the potential is there and that they can leverage also that weakness by constructing other types of systems and other types of memes and propagate. They even, I think they have a part where they talk about the importance of producing your own memetic content, be it in politics or.
Okay, thanks. I lacked the technical tools to actually assess the critique being made so this is clearer now. Thanks.
But I think so. The thing that's interesting is that this point that is coming up in this discussion is the same one I wanted to make about what Scott and I guess you were saying about words or repurposing words, and maybe to the larger question. Though I'm not 100% sure. I'm still I haven't fully grokked xenofeminism and its extensions politically. But the idea, I think, that I would say about the over optimism in some sense of the birth of the internet, which, you know, led to a speculative financial bubble, and it also was a meme in a political and social sense, and that people took it on to be a panacea for solving problems that came out of things like potentially patriarchy or hierarchy. But at the end of the day, you know, these new approaches or tools, I think they gain currency in some sense in their actual use, right? So, I mean, I think Derrida is probably the person I think most closely associated with this idea that, you know, the meaning of a word is in some sense its use and its relationship to other words. And so, though that's echoed by I think many people, when you try to repurpose a word by kind of yanking it out of that space and moving it, you don't really end up repurposing it. You know, you change its like sign, but you don't really change its signification. Whereas when you actually change the system in some way structurally or adjust it, you know, or you wear down a word by making it connected to so many things that it no longer has a real meaning, or you sort of slowly shift the contexts, the things around it so that it changes its meaning. Those seem to be the real place where change happens. And I think this is like one of these things, and I guess it's a little ambiguous, you know, take cases like the N word and its appropriation by the African American community in America. And you see something where it was something that probably did shift by this conscious use, but it's also something that sort of in the end became an us versus them thing because it could only be shifted within one community. It wasn't in the end like a taking it back. So coming back to this like earlier question, I guess part of what you can do is you can say, okay, I'd like to repurpose or reframe words, but those have to, I guess, have like attachment to practice or some, you know, social or use changes in order for them to really change. So I don't know at least what you guys thought about that on the word level, and then maybe on the larger level.
I think I agree with you in the fact that practice and on like deeds, let's say on a societal level, need to be associated with that repurposing. But I tend to disagree on the fact that reappropriating a word doesn't have valuable effects to it, because referring back to Derrida, indeed meaning is formed via relations to other words, but the main point there is how one word differentiates itself from other words, and how that one instance of differentiation is based on a broader spectrum of potential virtual differentiation. So a word is never static, is never absolute in its meaning. And I feel like, especially reappropriations from certain racial or trans or sexual communities, have done a great job at showing how repurposing a word doesn't change the system, but it does inscribe awareness into the system about the inexhaustibility of one word. So let's take rationality here. It's a more neutral word. By repurposing it, you also inscribe into it the awareness that the process behind it or the meaning behind it is not exhausted by its current usage. And that brings within the word or within the concept a duality that I think is compatible with what we try to do in TTT, to say that any instantiation, any situation of a word, a person, or a thing is never exhausted by that one variation of itself. It's always inscribed with this duality, let's say, of this concrete thing and its endless possibility, history, and relationality.
I think it's worth pointing out that like the language, so language is, there's a certain aspect of naturalism which I think xenofeminism objects to, which is used to empower groups. And it's so like you change something to having an essential or being natural if you want to empower it, and you change it to being a construct if you want to disempower it. So like there was a big issue in the US recently when Amy Coney Barrett referred to how sexual preference should impact something. And she didn't say anything particularly bad, except she used the word preference. And crucially, a lot of the steps in gay rights in the US has been about orientation, not orientation being the term, not the preference. The idea being it's not a lifestyle choice, it's the way you were born. So therefore, it's a right and it's a matter of rights and not a matter of lifestyle preference. So if you want to, a lot of those movements in general have made things inescapable or natural, so that they were sort of like the air was taken out of the attacks by conservatives. At the same time, you can undermine what conservatives think are important by saying that they're not real, they're constructs. So you can sort of cut what matters out of them and use those phrases and then undermine their power. And then you can add what matters to them, which is some sort of sacredness, into other things to make them empowered. Like, I don't know how much of the effectiveness of that is that the power structures that are often being directly impacted with are conservative. Like there's this nice look at the difference between what conservative morality and non-conservative morality are and how they differ. And it seems that like liberal morality focuses on harm and fairness, whereas conservative has this component also of loyalty and sacredness as well as harm and fairness. So by making things a construct, you remove the sacred. And then by adding in an essential, you make them sacred. So it seems like it's targeted at conservative thinking. But I don't know, like the xenofeminist position I like because it gets away from the language being misused almost. Because like, I think now we're all at a point where we don't, and most people would not think that it wouldn't be okay to be married if you were, say, bisexual, right? But the original strength behind to be married to someone of the same gender if you're bisexual, even though the impetus behind the gay rights movement in the US was that it wasn't a choice. Now that they've won that battle, it can be a choice again, as long as that's expressed by people who clearly believe that it's okay that those people have rights. If it's a conservative that then pretends it's not a choice, that rings alarm bells.
Yeah, that's the rationality argument, Scott. You just circled it back to the rationality argument that they need to have, because that validates that the fact that you are free to have sexual intercourse with whomever you want is a valid decision.
So they need rationality to replace what was previously that natural. Yeah, that's sort of what I thought. Like they're looking for a place to derive power, and I think, in contrary to a lot of the more critical movements, they don't see that power as a problem, right? Like most, whether it's critical race theory or stuff about patriarchy and all this, they sort of point out what the power structure is and then they undermine it. But here, it seems a little different.
They have a cool quote, if I may read, that reads, gender abolitionism is not code for the eradication of what are currently considered gendered traits from the human population. Under patriarchy, such a project could only spell disaster. The notion of what is gendered sticks disproportionately to the feminine. But even if this balance were redressed, we have no interest in seeing the sexual diversity of the world reduced. Let 100 sexes bloom. Gender abolitionism is shorthand for the ambition to construct a society where traits currently assembled under the rubric of gender no longer furnish a grid for the asymmetric operation of power. And then they extend this to race, and they extend this to with a beautiful quote that they say, ultimately, every emancipatory abolitionism must include towards the horizon of class abolitionism, since it is in capitalism where we encounter oppression in its transparent, denaturalized form. You're not exploited or oppressed because you are a wage laborer or poor. You are laborer or poor because you are exploited. So I think it's
The last part is very American, isn't it?
yeah.
As if like mercantilism was not oppressive and like feudalism was not oppressive. But the feudalism was quite nasty, I think. You didn't even own your farm. It's awful.
Yeah, but this is like the it's like the refined version, it's like the gourmet capitalism is like the gourmet burger of oppression.
Yeah, it's either the distilled version of these things or the umbrella category because they forget history, goes further back.
Yeah, I was just reading this quote because I think it expands to other things other than gender, like the stuff that you were talking about. It's they're trying to say that, of course, it would be ridiculous to just like change gears and go into, for example, oh, everyone should be able to use the N-word, like Eric was saying. That would be completely ridiculous, right? But I guess they're aiming towards this this way in which people are empowered enough and they're quote unquote rational enough that they have the power to decide if it's okay or not to use a certain word in a certain scenario, and they are responsible also for those actions.
But I guess like I understand now what Scott was trying to say, that they try to get away from this postmodern dilemma in which there are no grounds for anything,
Yeah.
which might seem liberative but can also be misused. Like Scott was giving this example that political campaigns in Russia used this this logic in order to promote one political agenda, right, Scott?
Yeah, this idea of nonlinear warfare, I think, well, they used it in battle, but in sense of elections, they just like funded opposition political parties and then made it known they were funding them. So they created like an undefined miasma of confusion, which made all actions pointless.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I still think Navalny might actually be like the guy they want in charge next. This is all just a thing that they're doing to get his support. It would be very much like many of the other political actions the government has taken. Not that I mean to sound conspiratorial, I'm mostly joking, but it fits.
So yeah, but so I understand their fondness for rationality, but I feel it still brings up conceptual tensions that maybe can be dealt away with if this emphasis on rationality wouldn't be this strong.
Yeah, I feel with a lot of this is, can't we just trust each other? Like, do we have to have some shining light somewhere that we look to, that's where the truth shines out of, whether it's rationality or whatever else, like whatever this key part of each theory tends to be? Can't we just like leave that aside and then have a conversation and try and use our best judgment? I don't think we constantly need to resort to some fundamental place where a lot of truth happens to come from. It just doesn't.
I agree, and I actually think introducing this hope of the shining light in an what's it called, alienation framework, which is connected to nihilism in my view, is like it's tending towards right wing politics, in a sense in which you have the same movement through the destruction of values only to rediscover what is authentic, and by that authenticity to impose power structures which present themselves as superior to former power structures. And I feel this is something that I react a bit aggressively to. But I guess, yeah, this is the vagueness of political discourse where you can never actually, I don't know.
I respect that it's trying to give itself a backbone and react to criticisms of similar movements where there often seem to be like that they change according to what is needed, or that they're not based on any clear rationality, I guess, or reason. Like I do like that, but I just don't like the fact that the spine they've used and created is just sort of artificial.
Okay, Tiago, do you want to maybe say some final words on the picture, like how it
Yeah.
connects?
So I can say two things. One is I'll put the link here to the manifesto. And the website is really colorful and has many languages, so you can read it in your favorite language. And crucially, it has something that I think it really spoke to me the first time that I read this. They have a section on the website called resources/critique, and it's an entire section with I think like 30 or 40 articles, all of them criticizing the manifesto. They have this entire section on the criticism. So I think we maybe can scourge that and try and look for some appeal to rationality, some critiques of their usage of rationality in there. Uh, I don't know. I just think it's pretty cool. It's also uh, editable, so you can send proposals of edits, and they will publish your edited version. Great. They will publish your own edited version of the manifesto if you so feel like doing it on their own website. I think those are pretty cool and cool things. Yeah. As for the photo, if you have never heard the music from this artist Arca, um, it's really amazing. I am really big fan. They are from Venezuela, and they do basically experimental electronic music with a twist of pop and also reggaeton and other sounds of Latin America, but in a very weird, glitchy way. Luis maybe is better to talk about this because he's the musician of the house, but I really admire them.
I decided to be a musician because I suck at talking about music. For that, I'd be a music critic.
Anyways, their newest music video is really cool. I was just showing it to Luis this afternoon.